In March of 1987, Preston Vale paid $1.06 million for 612 acres of river-bottom farmland beside an old tenant farmer named Walter Kline. Before the courthouse clerk finished stamping the deed, Walter gave him one warning. Don't cut the Willow line. Preston smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided the room belongs to him. By October, the field was moving under his boots. The closing happened on a wet Tuesday morning at the Benton County Courthouse, in a records room that smelled of varnish, damp coats, and paper too old to bend. Rain had washed the square clean before daylight. Pickup trucks sat in a crooked row outside the hardware store. A ceiling fan turned lazily above the clerk's counter, pushing the same stale air from one corner to another. Preston Vale stood at the counter in a charcoal suit, signing his name with a gold pen. He owned Vale Feed and Storage, 2 grain elevators, a trucking yard, and half interest in a fertilizer outfit near the interstate. He was 46, heavy through the shoulders, polished in a way that made dirt look like something other people dealt with. His new black Cadillac was parked outside with the heater running. The farm he had just bought was the old Bixler Bottom. 612 acres of dark soil, pasture, cottonwood timber, and low ground along the Wapsie River. The Bixlers had owned it for almost 80 years. The last brother had gone into assisted living, and the cousins who inherited the place had no interest in fences, taxes, or flood silt. Preston wanted the land cleared, tiled, leveled, and planted before the first hard freeze. He had plans. Straight roads, straight rows, new drainage, a storage shed big enough to hold 2 combines. Soybeans first, corn the following year, then irrigation if the numbers behaved. Walter Kline watched from beside the tall courthouse window. Nobody had invited him, but nobody could honestly say he did not belong there. Walter's 83 acres touched the Bixler Bottom along a bent fence line that had outlasted 3 marriages, 2 floods, and 1 courthouse fight over a washed-out culvert. He was 74, narrow as a rake handle, with a face cut by weather and work. His canvas coat was shiny at the elbows. His boots had been resoled so many times they looked more repaired than made. Most people in Benton County knew Walter. Few listened to him. They knew his wife Anna had died 6 winters earlier. They knew he still milked 2 cows, even though it made no sense. They knew he kept rain marks in pencil on the pantry wall. They knew he noticed where frogs crossed the road, where cattle refused to lie down, and where fence staples rusted faster than they should. The men at Rena's diner called it Kline's swamp wisdom when they wanted a laugh. Preston saw him by the window and gave a public smile. "Mr. Kline," he said, "looks like we'll be sharing a boundary." Walter nodded once. "Looks that way." Preston slid the deed into a leather folder. "You may be glad to see that old Bixler mess cleaned up. Place has been wasting itself for 20 years. "It wasn't wasting itself," Walter said. "It was holding itself." The lawyer looked up. Preston's smile stayed in place, but it lost its warmth. "Holding itself?" Walter stepped away from the window. He did not raise his voice. That was one of the reasons people mistook him for harmless. "There's a willow line along the North Sag," he said. "Willow, box elder, wild plum, and a few old posts grown into the trunks. Don't cut it." Preston waited, expecting the punch line. Walter added, And don't cap the stone mouth. The what? The old relief run. Preston gave a soft laugh. Mister, near's coming from Cedar Rapids, a drainage contractor out of Marshalltown, aerial photos, soil maps, financing, and a planting schedule that does not include farming around brush and ghost ditches. Walter looked at him for a long second. You'll find the wet places, he said. That doesn't mean you'll understand the water. The room went quiet, in that painful way rooms do when an old man says something plain and a rich man has witnesses. Preston closed the folder. I didn't buy $1 million farm to obey stories my grandfather outgrew. The lawyer chuckled first. Then the clerk's assistant smiled into her typewriter ribbon. Not much. Smiled into her typewriter ribbon. Not much. Just enough to show which man mattered. Preston walked out into the wet morning. Walter stayed at the window and watched the Cadillac pull away from the square. Beyond the courthouse roofs, past the elevator, the Baptist church, and the wet line of telephone poles, lay the low, dark ground where the Bixler bottom met his own. The Willow line was not beautiful. From a distance, it looked like a dirty seam stitched across the field. In winter it was gray and ragged. In summer it was too thick to mow. It caught limbs, feed sacks, and blown weeds. Modern men hated things like that. They saw wasted rows, crooked turns, and shade where shade had not been ordered. Walter saw something else. He saw the place where his father had stood in 1948 with a lantern tied to a fence post. He saw the green water that had come up from below, not down from the sky. He saw the old stone mouth opening under the willow roots, breathing water away from ground that looked solid until it wasn't. By noon, Preston's purchase had become the only subject at Rena's diner. Rena's sat between a parts store and a barber shop that still advertised $2 shaves no one had sold since 1969. It had 5 booths, 12 counter stools, and a pie case that held lemon, raisin cream, and whatever Rena's sister had made the night before. The place smelled of coffee, bacon, wet wool, and the hot metal of the grill. Preston came in with his lawyer, his drainage contractor, and Miles Decker from First County Bank. Men moved hats off stools before he asked. Rena poured him coffee without asking. So, said Earl Madsen, who raised hogs east of town and loved a big plan as long as he was not paying for it, you really going to straighten that Bixler jungle? Preston stirred cream into his cup. Only the parts nature failed to organize. The men laughed. North sag first, Preston said. Cut the willow line, burn the brush, cap that little rock hole, tile the seep, level the bottom, and seed winter rye before November. By spring, it'll look like a farm. Rena glanced toward the door. Walter told him not to cut it, she said. That was all it took. A soft laugh moved along the counter. Dale Horner, who sold seed and jokes with equal confidence, leaned back. Walter still hearing water talk through fence wire. Preston lifted both hands. I was warned about a stone mouth that apparently breathes. Better not make it mad, Dale said. Might swallow your tractor. The bell above the diner door rang then. Walter stepped inside. The room did not fall silent all at once. It thinned, one conversation at a time. A spoon touched a saucer. Someone cleared his throat. Rena reached for a clean cup. Coffee, Walter? Please. Preston turned on his stool. Mr. Kline, we were discussing modern agriculture. So I heard. Dale Horner leaned forward. "Tell us again about that rock hole." Walter wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. His knuckles were swollen from old breaks and cold mornings. A rock hole is just what men call a drain after they forget why it's there. A few men grinned. Preston sighed loudly enough for the counter. "Walter, I respect old habits, truly. But old habits do not pay bank interest. That land needs drainage, access, and production. The Willow line is in the way." "So is a levee," Walter said, "until the river remembers you." That line might have ended it in another room. But Preston Vale had not bought 612 acres to be corrected by a widower in patched boots. "Let me ask you something," Preston said. "If that Willow line is so valuable, why didn't the Bixlers get rich off it?" This laugh was sharper. Walter took a slow breath. "Because some things don't make you rich," he said. "They keep you from losing what money can't replace." Dale shook his head. Preston stood, set $2 under his cup, and looked around the room just long enough to make sure the audience was still his. "In 6 months," he said, "that ground will stop looking like a superstition." Then he turned to Walter. "When the first crop comes up, you can stand at the fence and tell me whether the water approves." He left, smiling. The laughter waited until the door closed, which counted as manners in that town. Walter finished half his coffee and drove home slowly. From the last rise before his place, he could see the whole Bixler bottom lying under the dull spring sky. The field looked generous. Broad black soil near the river. Generous. Broad black soil near the river. A shallow lift toward the north. Timber at the far edge. The kind of ground that made bankers lower their voices. But Walter looked first at the Willow line. It ran crooked and dark above the north sag, with the old relief run hidden beneath it. The stone mouth itself was invisible from the road. You had to know where to kneel. You had to know which roots were holding the bank, and which weeds grew over the flat limestone. You had to know that a dead run was not always dead. At home, Walter hung his coat on the nail by the stove and washed his hands. The house was quiet. Anna had once filled every room with small sounds, a drawer closing, a kettle lid rattling, a hymn hummed under her breath while she mended a shirt. 6 years after her funeral, the silence still seemed new on bad days. Walter opened the bottom drawer of the flower cabinet and removed a tobacco tin wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were folded maps, pencil notes, county copies, and 3 pages from his father's flood ledger. He spread them across the kitchen table. June 19th, 1948. Warm rain after river rise. Bixler North Sag took water from under the crust. Willow line held. Stonemouth opened at 11:40 p.m. Never cap it. May 4th, 1965. Countyman says old run should be filled for easier equipment pass. Told him water takes the old road when men close the new one. Walter read the line twice. Then he opened his own tablet. March 24th, 1987. Preston Vale bought Bixler Bottom. Plans to cut Willow line and cap Stone Mouth. Warned him at courthouse and diner. Laughed. He paused, listening. Across the field, far beyond the dark window, he could almost imagine the willows standing in the wet ground, holding their place in the gray evening. Walter wrote one more line. If he cuts before fall storm season, the sag may open into both farms. The crews came the next week. By 6:30 on Monday morning, 3 trucks were parked along the Bixler fence. A yellow dozer sat on the rise, coughing blue smoke. Orange flags had been pushed into the ground along the Willow line. Preston stood with his drainage contractor, pointing at places on a rolled plan. Walter stopped on his side of the wire. Preston saw him and gave the small smile of a man being patient for an audience. "Morning, Mr. Kline." "Morning." Walter unfolded one of the old maps against the top wire. "Before you start, you ought to look at this." Preston did not touch it. "What is it?" "Relief map. My father drew it after the '48 flood. This line is the run before it silted. This here is the spring pan. Water pushes under the clay here, then goes under the willows and out toward my west ditch. If you cap that mouth, pressure builds behind you." The contractor looked at the map like it had been written in coal smoke. Preston said, "We had aerials taken. Aerials show skin. We had soil tests. Not deep enough. You don't know that." Walter folded the map. "I know where cows won't stand." For a moment, only the dozer idled between them. Then Preston raised one hand. The blade dropped. The first willow came down with a sound like a wet bone cracking. By noon, the line had been broken in 4 places. By evening, roots that had held that sag since before Preston was born lay in twisted piles, their yellow wood raw where steel teeth had torn them open. Brush burned in 2 heaps. Smoke drifted low over the field. Walter watched once. After that, he went home and worked. He replaced a float in the stock tank. He patched a gate latch. He sharpened a mower blade he would not need for weeks. Every few hours he came inside and wrote down what he heard across the fence. Dozer at 6:41. Willow line broken by 10:25. Root pile burning west end at 3:10. Stone mouth flagged. Just before dark, Walter walked the fence. The air smelled wrong. Not rotten, not yet. Open. Like ground turned too deep. Near the largest willow stump, black water stood inside a dozer track. There had been no rain in 9 days. Walter crouched, touched it, and rubbed 2 fingers together. Cold. Not surface water, he wrote. Water in root track. No rain. Pressure showing. Behind him, his old Guernsey cow stood at the lower gate and would not come through. She stamped once, then backed away from the Bixler line. Animals did not explain themselves. That was why men ignored them. But they noticed what men missed. 2 days later, Preston's crew capped the stone mouth. They found the flat limestone exactly where Walter said it would be. That should have slowed them. Instead, it made them laugh. "Well, look at that," one worker said. "Found his cave." They pulled out the rotten boards, packed the opening with fill, then dragged a blade across the spot until the old mouth disappeared under a smooth brown layer of dirt. From the road, the field looked better already. Cleaner, wider, easier to understand. Ruined things often look improved before they fail. By mid-April, the Bixler bottom no longer looked abandoned. It looked conquered. Preston brought in equipment the way some men bring in soldiers. A new gravel entrance was cut from County Road 6. Rolls of black tile lay stacked on a trailer, like sleeping snakes. A steel machinery shed went up on the high shoulder above the sag. Its sign appeared by the entrance. Vale River Bottom Improvement Project, number trespassing. The men at Rena's admired the sign for 2 mornings. Looks serious, Earl said. Looks like money, Dale answered. Walter drove past without slowing. He had already seen the first fence post lean. It was new, treated pine, set 3 days earlier. At sunrise it had been straight. By evening it leaned toward Walter's pasture by less than an inch. Nothing to most men. Everything to a man who had learned that trouble rarely announces itself at full size. By the end of the week, 3 posts leaned. A tire rut filled with water on ground that should have stayed dry. Entrance settled down the middle like bread pressed by a thumb. Preston's contractor dumped more rock and called it compaction. Walter wrote it all down. On April 21st, he went to the county records office and asked for drainage easements on the old Bixler place. The clerk brought him a gray box tied with cotton string and told him not to sneeze into it. He found the paper near the bottom. Filed July 2nd, 1949. A county-recognized water relief easement crossing the northwest corner of the Bixler property into the Kline West Ditch. Signed by Joseph Kline, Henry Bixler, and a county commissioner whose name had faded, but not vanished. Walter paid 50 cents for a copy. When he stepped outside, Preston's Cadillac was at the curb. Preston stood beside Miles Decker from First County Bank. Preston saw the folded paper. Still digging, Walter? Somebody should know where the old work is. Preston opened his car door. Careful. A man who spends all day looking backward misses the future. Walter looked past him toward the low fields and the bare place where the Willow line had stood. No, he said. That's how I see it coming. In May, the first hard rain fell. It was not a flood, just a steady night rain, warm for the season, tapping on roofs and running soft in the ditches. At dawn, Walter walked his lower pasture. Water stood in the grass on his side of the fence. Not much, half an inch. A silver skin where no water should have been. He pushed a shovel handle into the soil. 6 inches down, the ground gave way, soft and hollow. Fear moved then. Not for Preston's first crop, not for the machinery shed, for the county road, for the Culver family's lower lot, for Rena's brother's hay barn downstream, for Walter's own west ditch if the pressure found the wrong exit. He called Miles Decker at the bank. Miles, you need to send someone before Vale lays more tile. The banker sighed the way educated men sigh before they become unhelpful. Walter, the bank can't interfere with a borrower's operation over neighbor worry. It's an easement. We'll have counsel look at it. When? When appropriate. Walter stared at the black phone on his kitchen wall. If that sag opens under his shed, it won't ask if the timing is appropriate. There was a pause. Then Miles softened his voice, which was worse. Walter, I know seeing the Bixler land change must be hard. Your father worked around that bottom for a long time. Walter closed his eyes. It's not memory I'm worried about. What is it? Pressure. By late summer, Preston had rye growing over the improved ground. From the road it looked good enough to prove every doubter foolish. Green rows ran clean across the field. The new shed shone silver on its gravel pad. Tile outlets trickled into a straight ditch. The sign at the road stood square again after being reset. At Rena's diner, men spoke of yield. Preston had ordered soybean seed for the following spring. The bank approved the second phase. Dale Horner said Preston might make the bottom carry itself by year 3 if the river stayed down. Someone asked Walter if his cow had changed her mind yet. Walter stirred his coffee. "No," he said. "She still won't stand by the lower gate." The men laughed. The weather turned warm when it should have cooled. The Wapsie rose twice after storms north of town, then dropped without making headlines. Leaves stayed on the cottonwoods late. Mosquitoes held on past their time. The air seemed to sit low over the fields, heavy and metallic. On October 8th, Walter found blue clay in his west ditch. 3 chunks, each no bigger than a walnut, caught in the grass against a bent reed. He picked one up and broke it open. Wet all the way through, cold as the bottom of a well. He wrote, "Blue clay in west ditch. Bixler sag moving under fill." 2 days later, the machinery shed door stopped closing. Preston's men blamed the track. They lifted the sliding door and reset it. The next morning it jammed again. The corner of the concrete pad had dropped half an inch. The contractor said, "Settling." Walter said nothing. On October 17th, the sky turned yellow-green before supper. The radio called for heavy rain across the Wapsie Basin. Nothing dramatic at first. No one panicked. Farmers had work to finish, and people in low country learned not to fear every forecast, or they would never sleep. Walter did not like the wind. It came from the east, warm and still at the same time, pressing against the windows. His cows bunched by the barn instead of grazing. The Guernsey kept facing the Bixler field, ears forward. At 7:12, the first hail hit the tin roof. One hard crack. Then the sky opened. By 8 o'clock, rain was coming sideways. It blew under the porch roof, hammered the barn, filled ruts, and turned the yard into a shallow brown mirror. Walter loaded his truck by lantern light. Shovel, pry bar, axe, rope, chainsaw, fence pliers, 2 feed sacks, and the oilcloth map. At 9:28, the phone rang. It was May Culver from downstream. Her voice shook through the static. "Walter, water's backing into our calf shed." "How high?" "Past the door sill." Walter looked at the kitchen window, black with rain. May's place sat below the old relief route. If water had reached her shed already, Preston's improved field was not draining. It was holding. Walter hung up and drove. The old Ford started on the second try. Its headlights made 2 weak tunnels through the rain. Water crossed County Road 6 in brown sheets. Twice the truck slid, and twice Walter let it slide before steering out. At Preston's entrance, the painted sign leaned in the mud. Floodlights glared near the machinery shed. Men shouted through the rain. A tractor sat sunk near the old sag, its rear wheels buried to the hubs. 2 pickups had been parked too close to low ground and could not move. The gravel entrance had split down the center, water boiling through it from below. Preston stood in a yellow raincoat, soaked through, yelling at his foreman. "Cut it south." "It won't take it," the man shouted. "It's coming back through the tile." Walter stepped out with a map under his coat. Preston saw him. "You need to leave," he shouted. "This is private property." Walter looked past him. The field was moving. not sliding like mud on a hill, lifting, settling, breathing. A wide strip of ride bent upward, then split open with a wet, tearing sound. Brown water and blue clay burst through the crack. One of the workers fell backward. Preston went pale. Spring pan opened, Walter said. The words nearly vanished in the rain. A shout came from the lower fence. Preston's cattle had crowded against the wire, trapped between rising water and the cut bank along the filled run. A calf bawled somewhere in the dark, high and thin. Sheriff Nolan arrived at 10:04 with 2 volunteer firemen in a county truck. Behind them came May Culver's son and the same young equipment operator who had laughed at the stone mouth in April. He was not laughing now. "We need to move water," the sheriff yelled. Preston pointed south. "There's a ditch there." Walter shook his head. "Won't take it." "How do you know?" Preston snapped. "How do you know?" Preston snapped. "Because it never did." Walter pulled the easement copy from inside his coat and pushed it into the sheriff's wet hands. "Old relief route crosses here to my west ditch. County recognized. If we open the stone mouth now, it'll pull pressure off before it takes May's barn and the road culvert." Preston stepped between them. "You are not cutting across my field." Walter looked at him then, rain running off the brim of his hat. "You bought dirt," he said. "You didn't buy the water under it." The sheriff unfolded the paper under the truck's headlights. The rain blurred the ink, but not enough. "He's got an easement," the sheriff said. "That paper is 38 years old," Preston said. "So is the mistake," Walter answered. The sheriff looked at the split ground, the trapped cattle, the boiling gravel, and the men standing ankle-deep in water that had no place to go. "Open it." They followed Walter to the place where the stone mouth had been buried. Preston's crew had covered it with fill, roots, and broken brush. But Walter knew the angle of the old willows. He knew where the flat stone should be. He drove the pry bar down once. Mud. Again. Stone. He dropped to one knee and clawed at the fill with both hands. May's son took a shovel and joined him. Then a fireman. Then the young operator. Preston stood back for half a minute, breathing hard, watching men dig into the place he had paid to erase. Then he grabbed a shovel. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. They uncovered limestone, packed clay, willow roots, and the crushed end of a board wedged deep in the mouth. Water pooled around their boots, but did not move. Preston shouted over the storm, "It's sealed!" Walter slid the pry bar under the cedar plug. "No," he said. "It's waiting." He leaned with his whole weight. His boots slipped. His bad shoulder flared white-hot. The young operator caught the bar with him. "Again," Walter said. They pushed. The plug shifted. A deep sucking sound came from under the ground. Everyone froze. Then the old relief run took its first breath in 22 years. Water dropped around their boots as if the earth had opened a throat. The pool spun dark, then pulled hard toward the buried stones. Mud, leaves, rye, and blue clay vanished into the opening. 30 yards away, the boiling tile line slowed. The split field still poured water, but now it had somewhere to go. No one laughed. Not Preston, not Miles Decker, who had arrived in polished shoes and now stood speechless beneath an umbrella. the contractor, who kept saying, "That should not happen," while it continued happening in front of him. Walter pointed toward the lower fence. "Cut the second brace, not the low corner. They'll run into the break if you open that side." Preston looked at him. For the first time since March, he did exactly what Walter said. The wire fought the pliers. Rain had packed it with grass and mud. Staples held tight in the new posts. Preston cursed once, slipped once, then went silent when the calf bawled again from the dark. The brace snapped loose. The fireman swung the panel open. Metal surged uphill in a black, panicked mass of horns, mud, steam, and rolling eyes. One heifer went down. Walter stepped close enough to slap her flank with his hat. "Up! Come on, girl! Up!" She lurched forward just as the bank behind her folded into the water. 8 feet of ground disappeared with a sound like wet canvas ripping. Preston stared at the gap. If they had cut the wrong corner, half the herd would have followed it. By midnight, the relief run was full. It carried water beneath the old willow roots that were no longer there, through the stone mouth, across Walter's west ditch, and into the natural swale that led to the safe side of the county culvert. It did not save Preston's field. Nothing that old and narrow could swallow a whole ruined improvement project. But it changed the direction of the disaster. That was enough. Walter moved through the storm like a man reading a page only he could see. "Keep trucks off that gravel. Send the calves through the high gap. Don't stand near the tile outlet. Leave the shed. It's already gone." Miles Decker stared at the machinery shed, where one silver wall had begun to lean. "We need to get equipment out," he shouted. Walter turned on him so sharply, even Preston looked over. "Save the men first." Nobody answered. A minute later, the concrete pad cracked. The sound was dull and final. The north corner of the shed sank, taking a mower, stacked seed, and 2 toolboxes with it. Miles stepped back as his umbrella turned inside out in the wind. Preston watched his clean plan bend into the mud. He did not shout this time. He just stood with the fence pliers in his hand and water running from his sleeves, looking suddenly older than he had that morning. By 3 o'clock, the rain eased. The river was still rising, but the worst pressure had shifted into the old run. May Culver's calf shed had water against the threshold, but not inside. The county road lost gravel, but the culvert held. Walter's west ditch ran full and brown, but it stayed inside its banks. The Bixler bottom looked, at first light, like something had clawed it open. The smooth rye field was cut by raw brown wounds. The capped relief route had reappeared, not as a neat line, but as a torn scar. 39 acres lay under silt and standing water. The gravel entrance was gone in 2 places. A tractor sat sunk to the hubs. The machinery shed leaned, its doors twisted like tin after a fire. Men stood in the gray morning without speaking. The same men who had laughed at the diner. Mud has a way of taking the shine off certainty. Preston walked to Walter near the stone mouth. His raincoat was torn. His boots were ruined. There was mud on his face and a cut across one hand. "How did you know where to open it?" Walter looked down at the water still moving through the stones. "My father opened it in 48, he said. I opened it with him in 65. I kept it clear because he told me to." Preston swallowed. "I thought it was just a hole." "It was," Walter said. "That's why it mattered." 3 days later, the county engineer came with maps, rods, and the careful expression of a man who expects the land to answer politely. Walter met him at the kitchen table with the old ledger pages, the 1949 easement, and his own notes from March through the storm. At first the engineer handled the papers like family history. Then he walked the field. The old sag matched. The spring pan matched. The blue clay seam matched. The stone mouth matched. The place where the machinery shed sank sat less than 15 feet from Walter's father's pencil mark. Ground hollow, after warm river rain. By noon, the engineer had stopped smiling. He asked if he could copy the ledger pages. A county meeting was held the following week in the courthouse basement. Farmers came from both sides of the river. Some had lost gravel. Some wanted to hear how much money Preston had lost. A few came because shame is easier to carry when everybody calls it concern. Preston sat in the second row, hands folded, eyes down. He no longer looked like a man who owned 612 acres. He looked like a man who had learned that owning ground is not the same as understanding it. The county engineer stood at the front with a flood map and a clear overlay. The fresh damage line from the storm followed the old pencil marks almost exactly. The sag, the spring pan, the stone mouth, the swale, the culvert. This location, the engineer said, tapping the overlay, was identified in the Kline family records decades ago. No one laughed. Miles Decker asked whether the bank could receive copies. Walter looked at him. A copy won't help if it only gets read after the rain. That sentence moved through the room slowly. Then Preston stood. For a moment, Walter thought he might defend himself, blame the contractor, blame the storm, blame the old maps, the bank, the county, the Bixlers, anyone except his own certainty. Preston turned to the room. "I was warned," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "I was warned at the courthouse. I was warned at the fence. I was warned in front of some of you, and I laughed." The room held still. I cut what I didn't understand. I sealed what I thought was useless. I was wrong. That was all. But in a town where men could speak for an hour without admitting anything, it sounded almost like thunder. The county ordered the relief easement restored. The bank froze Preston's second phase. Insurance covered part of the equipment loss, but not the grading, not the bad fill, not the buried drainage, not the confidence that had made the damage larger than the storm needed it to be. Preston sold one planter before it ever made a full season. He sold the extra tile rolls at a loss. The Vail River Bottom Improvement Project became smaller, rougher, slower, and more expensive than his numbers had promised. By December, the stone mouth was open again. Not pretty, not yet. The old run cut crooked through raw dirt and straw, marked by fresh rock and survey stakes. The willow line was gone, but Walter made Preston plant a new one. Willow, box elder, plum, and cottonwood staggered along the north sag where the old roots had once held. They planted under a cold, white sky. Two men worked side by side in silence, one old and slow, one younger, blistered, and careful. Preston tried to pay Walter for the days. Walter accepted half. "You'll need the rest for trees," he said. Preston did not argue. That was how people first knew something in him had changed. Not everything. Men like Preston do not become humble in one storm. He still wanted clean numbers. He still liked straight rows, too quickly in rooms where silence might have taught him more. But he stopped calling crooked ground wasted. He stopped saying ghost ditch. And when hard rain came from the north, he drove to the Bixler bottom himself and watched the stone mouth before he watched the field. The following spring, Walter brought the local FFA class down to the restored run. 23 students climbed out of a yellow bus with notebooks, rubber boots, and the half-bored faces of teenagers who had been promised agriculture and expected a mud hole. Preston came too. He stood near the fence, hands in his jacket pockets, letting Walter talk. Near the fence, hands in his jacket pockets, letting Walter talk. Walter showed the students the flood mark on his barn post. He showed them the blue clay. He showed them where the water had lifted the rye. He showed them the stone mouth and the young willow shoots no higher than a child's shoulder. He passed around the old ledger pages in plastic sleeves and made every student hold them with both hands. A boy in a blue jacket raised his hand. "Mr. Kline," he asked, "how'd you know the water would come back?" Walter looked across the field. The restored run caught the afternoon light in a thin silver line. The young willows shook in the wind. Preston's new planting stood lower than he had hoped, but alive. "I didn't know more than everybody," Walter said. He touched the old ledger with 2 fingers. "I just believed the people who watched before me." The boy wrote it down. Walter saw the pencil move across the page, and for some reason that nearly broke his heart. That evening, after the bus left and Preston drove home, Walter closed the barn alone. He stopped beside Anna's old rain marks on the doorframe and rested his hand there. The air smelled of damp grass, cattle, and river mud. Not danger now. Memory. Across the fence, the new willow line was thin and unimpressive, as before it looked like anything worth saving. But its roots were starting. And for Walter Kline, that was enough. Because some land does not need a richer owner. It needs someone patient enough to listen before the ground starts moving.